Before the fever, there was the calm. In the year 1847, California was a distant and sleepy province of Mexico, a place at the end of the known world. Its population was a sparse mix of Native Americans, missionary monks, and a few Mexican ranchers, the Californios, who governed vast tracts of land dedicated to raising cattle. Life followed the slow rhythm of the seasons. The Golden Hills, not yet populated by dreams of wealth, were home to bears and deer. San Francisco, then called Yerba Buena, was a small port village with only a few hundred inhabitants. California was a land of sun, dust, and a profound silence, a pastoral landscape almost untouched by the haste of the industrial world exploding on the continent's east coast. This idyllic world, however, was already in flux. The recent Mexican-American War had formally transferred control of this vast territory to the United States, although the change was, at first, felt more on paper than in practice. Most Americans saw California as a remote outpost, useful perhaps for its ports, but certainly not as the epicenter of the nation's future. For the few Americans who lived there, like the Swiss entrepreneur John Sutter, the land promised a new life based on agriculture and commerce. Sutter built a fort and a mill, dreaming of creating a private agricultural empire, a new beginning far from the complexities of the old world. His dream was of lumber and grain, not of metal. The epicenter of the change would not be a battlefield or a government hall, but the quiet banks of the American River, a river that winds through the hills of the Sierra Nevada. It was there on the cold, clear morning of January 24, 1848, that a carpenter named James W. Marshall, hired by Sutter to build a sawmill, was inspecting the newly dug water channel. His eyes were drawn to an unusual gleam in the stream bed. He bent down, picked up a few small metallic flakes from the icy water, and examined them in the palm of his hand. The metal was heavy, malleable, and of an unmistakable yellow. In that instant, he held the trigger of the largest mass migration in American history. The anomaly was this: in a land whose wealth was measured in acres of pasture and heads of cattle, a new form of value emerged, concentrated, pure, and almost mythical: gold. Marshall, with his heart racing, took his discovery to John Sutter. Tests confirmed their suspicions. It was gold. Sutter's reaction, however, was not of joy, but of deep dread. He understood immediately that the discovery would not be the foundation of his agricultural empire, but its ruin. He knew that if the news spread, his land would be invaded, his workers would abandon him, and his pastoral dream would be trampled by a horde of men crazed by greed. The secret, however, was too heavy to keep. Sutter and Marshall tried to keep the discovery under wraps, but the news leaked out, first as a whisper among the mill workers, a rumor that drifted down the river, told in low voices in taverns and camps. It was a story too good to be true, but too irresistible not to be repeated. It was the beginning of an infection, a contagion of hope and covetousness that would soon spread beyond the riverbanks. The gold, buried for millennia beneath the California hills, began to exert its power on the human imagination, promising an instant reversal of fortune, a new life forged not by the slow sweat of agriculture, but by the lucky strike of a pickaxe. The initial hook of this great saga is not, therefore, the sound of a celebrating crowd, but the tense silence of a few men guarding a world-changing secret. It is the story of an accidental glint in the water, a discovery that threatened to destroy one man's dream to fulfill that of millions. The stage was set for an inevitable conflict between the old pastoral world of California and the new era of industrialization and individual ambition that was about to land on its shores. The quiet land was about to be violently awakened, and the catalyst was a handful of yellow nuggets in a carpenter's hand. Sutter's secret was as fragile as glass, destined to shatter against the hard rock of human ambition. The news began to leak, not as a flood, but as a trickle. Sutter's workers, sworn to secrecy, couldn't resist using their newfound gold to buy whiskey and other supplies at local stores. A rumor here, a nugget shown in confidence there. The story traveled downriver to the small, windy port town of San Francisco. At first, it was met with the skepticism of a community accustomed to sailors' tales. Gold in the hills? It was just another fantastic story, probably an exaggeration to swindle newcomers. Life went on, for a brief moment, unchanged, while the nation's most explosive secret bubbled just beneath the surface of public consciousness. The turning point, the moment the rumor became a fever, can be credited to one shrewd and enterprising man, Samuel Brannan. A merchant and publisher of the town's only newspaper, Brannan was one of the first to grasp the magnitude of the discovery. He visited the gold fields, confirmed the truth of the reports, and instead of picking up a pickaxe, he saw a much larger business opportunity. He quickly bought up every shovel, pickaxe, and pan he could find. Then in May 1848, he orchestrated one of the most effective marketing stunts in history. He ran through the streets of San Francisco, waving a glass vial full of gold dust and shouting for all to hear, "Gold! Gold! Gold from the American River!" The reaction was instantaneous and absolute. Skepticism evaporated, replaced by a collective madness. San Francisco emptied out almost overnight. Brannan's own newspaper had to shut down, with a note explaining that its staff had run off to the gold fields. Soldiers deserted their posts, sailors abandoned their ships in the harbor, leaving behind a forest of unmanned masts that would rot in the bay for years. The social order disintegrated. Lawyers, doctors, artisans, all became prospectors. What was at stake was no longer a salary or the profit from a harvest. It was the chance to become a king in a day, the promise of completely rewriting one's own destiny with a single stroke of luck. The fever, initially contained within California, would soon infect the rest of the nation. The news traveled slowly, by ships rounding the continent and by letters crossing the country. But it was in December 1848 that the spark became a national wildfire. In his address to Congress, President James K. Polk officially confirmed the discovery, describing the abundance of gold in California in unequivocal terms. The confirmation from the highest authority in the land removed any lingering doubt. Newspapers from Boston to Charleston ran the news in bold headlines. The imagination of a young and ambitious nation was captured. California ceased to be a distant territory and became the destination of all dreams. Thus was born the 49er, the modern Argonaut. Throughout the East Coast and the Midwest, the gold fever spread like an epidemic. Men of all ages and classes were infected. Farmers mortgaged their lands, shopkeepers sold their businesses, young men left their families behind, all driven by a single, powerful vision of golden nuggets glistening at the bottom of a stream. They formed companies, bought wagons and supplies, and prepared for the monumental journey across the continent. The stakes were the highest possible. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, risking life and fortune for the promise of a wealth that defied imagination. But the fever did not respect borders. The news crossed the oceans, reaching Mexico, Chile, Peru, Europe, Australia, and even China. California's gold became a global legend. All over the world, restless and ambitious men began to plan their own pilgrimage to this new mecca of wealth. What was at stake now was not just the fate of individuals or even a nation, but the demographics of the globe itself. Marshall's discovery had lit the fuse for one of the largest and most diverse voluntary migrations in history. An entire world was about to converge on the golden hills of California, each carrying their own dream of fortune, ready to transform that sleepy land into the most chaotic and exciting place on the planet. With the arrival of spring in 1849, the Great Migration began. The frontier towns along the Missouri River, like Independence and St. Joseph, transformed into chaotic, teeming encampments, the jumping-off points for the overland journey. They were a sea of white canvas, the air thick with the smell of campfires, livestock, and a palpable electricity of anticipation. Men from all walks of life, now united by the title Argonauts, formed companies, bought mules and wagons, and said goodbye to their families. The investigation into the truth of the gold was over. Now began each man's personal investigation into his own limits of courage and endurance. They were not yet miners. They were pilgrims on their way to a promised land, about to embark on one of the greatest adventures of their lives. The most iconic route etched into the mythology of the American West was the Overland Trail, an odyssey of over 2,000 miles in covered wagons, crossing vast plains, unforgiving deserts, and the formidable barriers of the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. The journey was a brutal test of endurance, with painfully slow progress marked by dust, boredom, and the constant danger of broken axles or exhausted draft animals. Contrary to popular myths, the greatest danger did not come from Native American attacks, which were relatively rare, but from an invisible and far more lethal enemy: disease. Cholera, in particular, swept through the overcrowded and unsanitary encampments, turning the dream of wealth into a nightmare of sudden death and unmarked graves along the trail. For those on the East Coast, especially those with maritime experience, the sea path seemed a more civilized alternative. However, it was an equally daunting journey, a voyage of nearly 18,000 nautical miles around the tip of South America, the treacherous Cape Horn. The trip could last from 5 to 8 months, a test of patience and sanity. The ships, often overcrowded and ill-equipped, faced violent storms that could last for weeks, tossing the vessel back and forth. On board, the monotony was broken only by the threat of diseases like scurvy caused by poor nutrition, and by conflicts between passengers confined in a claustrophobic space for too long. It was a long and lonely purgatory at sea. There was a third option, a shortcut that promised speed but exacted a terrible price: the Panama route. This journey involved taking a ship to the Isthmus of Panama, crossing about 60 miles of dense, disease-ridden jungle on foot or in canoes, and then waiting on the Pacific coast for another ship to take them north to San Francisco. The jungle crossing was a nightmare, an alien environment of suffocating heat, swamps and mosquitoes that transmitted malaria and yellow fever. Many who survived the jungle trek died of cholera, while waiting for months in makeshift camps for passage on one of the few and overcrowded ships plying the Pacific route. It was the riskiest gamble of all. Regardless of the route, preparation was key. Each man carried with him the tools of his future profession, the instruments of his personal investigation for wealth. The simple metal pan was the most basic tool for testing the gravel of the rivers. The heavier rocker, or cradle, allowed for processing more earth with the help of a partner. The pickaxe and shovel were extensions of their own arms, used to break the soil and dig for the quartz vein. Along with the tools, they carried the supplies for their survival: flour, dried meat, coffee, a rifle for hunting and protection, and the most essential asset of all, an almost unshakable faith that fortune awaited them at the end of the journey. The human cost of this great investigation was immense. It is estimated that tens of thousands of people died on their way to California before they even had a chance to pan their first handful of dirt. They were victims of disease, accidents, starvation, and exhaustion. Each route had its own unmarked cemeteries. The journey itself acted as the most brutal of filters, selecting only the strongest, the luckiest, or perhaps the most stubborn. It was not just a trip. It was a transformative ordeal. Those who survived the trial arrived in California already changed, hardened by the experience, and even more desperate for the monumental sacrifice they had made to be worthwhile. The search for gold demanded a payment up front, often in human lives. The arrival in California was a shock in itself, a plunge into a world of feverish chaos. San Francisco, the gateway to the gold country, had transformed from a sleepy village into a metropolis of tents and hastily built wooden shacks. Its harbors were clogged with abandoned ships. Its muddy streets were a global pandemonium, a whirlwind of languages and cultures, with men from every nation on earth united by a single, fervent purpose. The air vibrated with a mixture of desperate hope and aggressive opportunism. For the newcomers, exhausted from the long journey, this was the final gate before the real investigation. The personal search for gold in the hills and rivers that lay to the east. From the ports, the men headed inland to the so-called diggings. Life in the mining camps was rudimentary and brutal. They were makeshift communities, overwhelmingly male, where the law was often dictated by force or an informal code of honor. The daily routine was a cycle of physically grueling labor, from sunrise to sunset, standing for hours in ice-cold streams, digging and sifting earth. The nights were spent in precarious tents or cabins, amidst an atmosphere of rough camaraderie, high-stakes gambling, low-quality whiskey, and a profound loneliness, tempered only by the shared dream of wealth that kept everyone moving. The turning point for each individual, the moment that validated all the sacrifice, was the eureka. In the early days of the rush, gold was relatively easy to find. It was placer gold, nuggets and flakes that had eroded from their sources in the mountains and been deposited in riverbeds and streams over millennia. The investigation was simple. Using a metal pan, the prospector would swirl a mixture of gravel and water, allowing the lighter earth to spill out, leaving, hopefully, the heavier gold behind. The sight of that first yellow glint in the bottom of the pan was a moment of pure ecstasy, the confirmation that the dream was real and fortune possible. However, the harsh reality soon set in, and this was the true turning point of the gold rush. The easy-to-find surface gold was the first to be depleted. The lucky ones who arrived in 1848 reaped the lowest hanging fruit. The great wave of 49ers who arrived the following year found a very different scene. The most promising streams were already claimed and overcrowded. The work became exponentially harder, requiring digging deeper and processing tons of earth to find just a few grams of gold. Many prospectors barely found enough to pay for the absurdly expensive supplies, falling into a cycle of hard labor for minimal reward. This growing difficulty forced a fundamental change in the tools and methods of investigation. The era of the lone prospector with his pan was coming to an end. To reach the gold that lay deeper, new technologies that required capital and teamwork were necessary. Hydraulic mining emerged, a brutally effective and ecologically devastating technique. High-pressure water cannons, called monitors, were aimed at hillsides, disintegrating them and washing tons of earth and gravel through long sluices to separate the gold. This was an industrial operation, no longer an individual dream. This was the turning point that separated the dreamers from the capitalists. The investigation revealed that the easy gold was a fleeting illusion. The true, lasting wealth was no longer within reach of the common individual. The gold rush was transforming from a democratic treasure hunt into an extractive industry. Power was shifting from the man with the pickaxe to the man with the money to finance large-scale operations. The investigation into how to find gold was complete. Now, the revelation would be about who really got rich, and the answer would surprise most of the men who had risked everything to be there. The great revelation of the gold rush, the fundamental truth hidden beneath the myth of the lucky prospector, is this: the vast majority of men who risked everything to dig for gold did not get rich. Many returned home empty-handed, in debt, and with their health ruined. Others died in California, anonymous and forgotten. The true and lasting fortunes of the gold era were not found in the ground, but rather made from the men who were digging in it. The real gold mine was the feverish crowd that came to excavate it. The real winners of the gold rush were not those who wielded the pickaxe, but those who sold the pickaxe. The prime example of this principle is Samuel Brannan, the man who ignited the fever in San Francisco. Brannan never bothered to get his boots muddy in a river. He was a capitalist, not an adventurer. Before his famous announcement, he used his inside knowledge to corner the market. He bought up every shovel, pan, pickaxe, sieve, and boot he could find. Then he opened a strategically located store at Sutter's Fort, the main waypoint to the gold fields. He sold shovels that cost 20 cents for $10 or $15 each. His fortune was built on the desperate needs of others, becoming the first millionaire of the gold rush without ever panning a single ounce of gold himself. Another future titan of American industry who forged his empire on the anvil of the gold rush was Leland Stanford. Along with his business partners, who would later be known as the Big Four of the Central Pacific Railroad, Stanford began his career in California as a humble shopkeeper. He sold tools and basic supplies to the miners. With the substantial and steady profits from his business, he and his partners accumulated the necessary capital to invest in a much bigger prize, the control of infrastructure. They understood that, in the long run, the real power was not in selling the tools for the journey, but in owning the road. The story of Levi Strauss is perhaps the most iconic and enduring business legacy of the gold rush. A German immigrant, Strauss arrived in San Francisco in 1853, not with dreams of gold, but with bolts of durable canvas, intending to make tents for the miners. However, he quickly heard the universal complaint of the men in the camps. Their cotton pants simply couldn't withstand the brutal work. In a stroke of marketing and innovation genius, Strauss used his sturdy canvas to create reinforced work overalls, the precursor to modern blue jeans. He didn't find gold. He identified a need and created a legendary product that would clothe America for generations. But it wasn't just the great magnates who prospered. A thriving service economy emerged to meet the needs of the massive and predominantly male population of the mining camps. In towns where a simple meal could cost a month's salary back home, owners of restaurants, saloons, and hotels made fortunes. Laundries charged exorbitant prices to wash a single shirt. Barbers, blacksmiths, doctors, and lawyers found an endless demand for their services. In an environment where men were far from home, any comfort or basic service was a luxury they were willing to pay for with their precious gold dust, transferring wealth from the lucky to the shrewd. This is the central logic of what is known today in the investment world as the picks and shovels play. During a gold rush, the safest bet is not on the individual prospector, whose success depends on luck and uncontrollable factors. The safest bet is on selling the essential tools and services that all prospectors, lucky or not, will need to buy. The revelation of the California gold rush is that the fever itself was the most valuable resource. Wealth came not from the rare metal, but from universal human psychology, hope, optimism, and the willingness to risk everything for a dream, making the dreamers the true vein to be mined. The most immediate and overwhelming consequence of the gold rush was an unprecedented population explosion. In 1848, the non-native population of California was approximately 15,000 people. By the end of 1849, that number had jumped to over 100,000. By 1852, it surpassed 220,000. This human flood transformed California into the most diverse place on the planet. Americans from the East, Mexicans, Chileans, Peruvians, Europeans from every nation, Australians, and a large number of Chinese all converged on the same rivers and cities. This volatile mix, thrown into an environment with no established laws and fierce competition for resources, created a society of an energy and social friction never seen before. This chaotic population growth forced an equally rapid political transformation. The American military government, which had been administering the newly acquired territory, was completely inadequate to govern such a vast and unruly population. The need for a legal framework to register mining claims, settle disputes, and establish a minimum of order was urgent. In a whirlwind process, California called a constitutional convention in 1849 and in 1850 was admitted to the Union as the 31st state, completely bypassing the territory stage. This rapid rise to statehood had enormous national repercussions, upsetting the fragile balance in Congress between slave and free states and accelerating the nation's march toward the Civil War. For the native peoples of California, the gold rush was not a dream, but an apocalypse. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of prospectors on their ancestral lands was a catastrophe. The rivers they depended on for fishing were polluted, the forests where they hunted were cut down, and the animals they fed on were driven away. The prospectors, in their overwhelming majority, saw the native people as mere obstacles or savages to be eliminated. Informal militias, and in some cases the state government itself, promoted campaigns of extermination. The indigenous population of California, estimated at 150,000 before the rush, plummeted to about 30,000 in just over 2 decades, a brutal act of genocide fueled by gold fever. The environmental impact of the gold rush was equally devastating and lasting. While the initial panning with pans was relatively harmless, the transition to industrial methods, especially hydraulic mining, caused ecological destruction on a massive scale. Giant water cannons, called monitors, fired jets of water with immense force, literally disintegrating entire hillsides to wash out the gold. Tons of sediment, gravel, and toxic waste, including mercury used to separate the gold, were dumped into the rivers. This destroyed aquatic ecosystems, wiped out salmon runs, and caused catastrophic flooding in the agricultural valleys hundreds of miles downstream. The landscape of California bears the scars of this violence to this day. The absence of an effective civil government and a functional justice system in the early years gave rise to a dangerously lawless society. The mining camps were notorious for their violence, with disputes over claims often settled with a knife or a bullet. In cities like San Francisco, crime was rampant. In response to this power vacuum, vigilance committees emerged. These were groups of citizens, usually merchants and businessmen, who took the law into their own hands. Acting as police, judge, jury, and executioner, they hunted down and publicly hanged alleged criminals, often with little evidence. While they claimed to restore order, these committees frequently targeted immigrants and minorities, imposing a form of brutal and xenophobic justice. Economically, the gold rush reconfigured California and the nation. The sudden and immense wealth extracted from the mines provided the capital that would help finance the Union side in the Civil War a decade later. The need to feed the enormous population of miners spurred the development of a powerful agricultural industry in California's valleys, which would become the nation's breadbasket. Furthermore, the need to connect the isolated California to the rest of the nation was the main catalyst for the greatest engineering project of the century, the Transcontinental Railroad. The revelation is that the gold fever was the violent and chaotic birth of the modern American West's economy, laying the foundation for its future power. We arrived then at the new reality forged in the fire of the gold fever. Our journey began in a pastoral and forgotten California, witnessed the accidental glint of a nugget, and followed the shockwave it sent across the world. We crossed the dangerous trails with the Argonauts, felt the disappointment in the mining fields, and discovered that the true winners were rarely those who got their hands dirty. We saw a society born from chaos, violence, and an unprecedented diversity. In less than a decade, California was catapulted from obscurity to the world stage, a process of transformation so rapid and violent that it left permanent marks on the land and its people. This new reality solidified the manifest destiny of the United States in a way that no other force could have. Before the gold rush, westward expansion was a slow, gradual process of farmers and pioneers. Gold transformed this expansion into an urgent and massive stampede. It pulled the nation's center of gravity westward, ensuring American control over the vast new territories acquired from Mexico. California was not just settled, it was inundated. The myth of the Wild West, a land of adventure, danger, and quick fortune, was born directly from this era, drawing hundreds of thousands of people and cementing the idea of a nation that stretched from coast to coast. The society that emerged in California was fundamentally different from the rest of the United States. On the East Coast, society was more stratified, with hierarchies based on family, class, and tradition. California, in contrast, was a chaotic meritocracy, where luck, grit, and shrewdness mattered more than your last name. It was a multicultural melting pot from its very inception, where Americans, Europeans, Latinos, and Chinese were forced to coexist, compete, and collaborate. From this friction, a new American identity was forged, more dynamic, individualistic, and often more volatile, a culture that valued reinvention and risk in a way that the more conservative East did not. The economic impact of the gold rush on the nation was monumental. The hundreds of millions of dollars in gold extracted from the hills of California were injected into the U.S. economy, providing a solid, hard currency base. This capital helped finance the growing industrial revolution in the East, paid for the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, and, crucially, gave the Union a decisive financial advantage that helped it win the Civil War. California's wealth did not just enrich individuals, it stabilized and strengthened the economy of a nation at one of its most critical moments, powering its rise as an industrial and global power. More than just gold, the rush manufactured an enduring myth, the California Dream. This was its origin story. California was etched into the collective psyche as a golden land of unlimited opportunity, a special place where one could escape the constraints of the past and reinvent one's life. It was the promise of a new beginning, blessed by the sun and by luck. This myth would prove to be as valuable as the gold itself, attracting successive waves of dreamers over the next century and a half. From the oil barons and Hollywood movie moguls to the tech pioneers of Silicon Valley, the pursuit of fortune became the state's identity. In the end, the new reality was that the transformation of California had been total and irreversible. The pastoral world of the Californios and the millennial way of life of the native peoples were swept away forever. The very landscape was physically re-sculpted by the fury of mining. The gold rush was not a simple historical event. It was a geological and sociological event, a convulsion that gave birth to a new world on the ashes of the old. The reality was that America no longer looked only to the Atlantic, to Europe, and to its own origins. Now it had a new and powerful face turned toward the Pacific, a face forged by greed, by hope, and by gold. By the late 1850s, the fever finally began to subside. The surface gold had all but vanished. The remaining wealth was locked in quartz veins deep within the earth, accessible only to corporations with the capital to invest in mine shafts, stamp mills, and wage labor. The lone prospector, the 49er with his pan and his dream, became a figure of the past, a romantic anachronism. The era of individual adventure gave way to the reality of industrial work. The rush was over. What remained was the industry. For most, the dream of striking it rich overnight had evaporated, replaced by the more modest and often more brutal pursuit of a simple wage. The final reflection on the gold rush leaves us with a profoundly dual legacy. On one hand, it is the quintessential American story, a saga of ambition, courage, innovation, and the creation of vast wealth that helped build a nation. It is the personification of optimism and the belief in personal reinvention. On the other hand, this success story was built upon a foundation of dark shadows. It is a story of genocide against native peoples, of violent racism against immigrants, of rampant exploitation, and of an environmental destruction whose scars remain. Any honest assessment of the gold rush must embrace this contradiction. It was both a catalyst for progress and a human and ecological catastrophe. The psychology of the gold fever transcends its time and place, offering a mirror to our own modern ambitions and vulnerabilities. The fever was not just about gold, it was about the seductive power of a simple narrative of quick enrichment, the fear of being left behind while others achieve fortune. We see echoes of this same psychology today in the speculative bubbles of the stock market, the meteoric rise of cryptocurrencies, or the startup culture of Silicon Valley, the direct descendant of the gold rush. The technology and the assets change, but human nature, the potent mix of hope, greed, and the social contagion of euphoria, remains the same. The gold rush teaches us how susceptible we are to narratives of instant fortune. And what of the stories that were lost? History is often told through the winners, the Sam Brannans and Leland Stanfords. But what about the hundreds of thousands of other lives that were drawn into the vortex of California? The stories of the women who ran boarding houses and found their own independence in the mining camps. The stories of the Chinese miners who faced brutal racism to send money to their families across the Pacific. The stories of the experienced and skilled Chilean and Mexican miners who were driven from their claims by force. The true history of the gold rush is a mosaic of countless silent triumphs and forgotten tragedies, whose voices have been largely drowned out by the noise of the official story. The most enduring legacy of the gold rush may not be the gold itself, but the mythology it created. More than any other event, it forged the indelible image of the American West. The lone, rugged prospector, the lawless frontier town, the saloon, the conflict with the natives, these archetypes became the building blocks of American cultural identity, exported to the world through books, Western films, and folklore. The gold rush was a historical event, but it transformed into a national creation story, a founding myth that speaks to the character and contradictions of the United States in a way few other events can. Ultimately, the California gold rush was much more than the search for a precious metal. It was a feverish search for a new kind of life, a massive gamble on the promise of America itself. In its chaotic crucible, it revealed the very best and the absolute worst of human nature when faced with the possibility of infinite wealth. Its legacy is etched into the landscape of California and the psyche of the nation, a permanent reminder that every great dream has a cost and that the foundations of our modern world are often built on the violent, hopeful, and transformative rushes of the past.